has been a really, really great meeting. Okay, yeah. So I thought what I would do today is talk about the Dog Aging Project. Probably many of you have heard about this project. I'm sure many of you have heard me talk about this project, so you're probably like, oh great, I have to listen to Matt give the same talk again. But I'll give you an update on where we are. I'm gonna at the end talk a little bit more about some of the challenges we faced, and also I think maybe some of the opportunities for the field in the area of advancing companion animals as a geroscience translational approach. So to start with, if I can control the remote. You know, this project, the Dog Aging Project, really came about, at least for me, by trying to answer this question, which I know many people in the field have been thinking about for a long time, which is how do we start to take some of what we've learned in the laboratory and ask, does it work the same way in the real world? And in this particular case, I'm talking about what we've learned about the biology of aging. And I think there are many approaches that are being taken. Many of you in this room are moving forward with translational studies in people for different endpoints or indications. But the approach that kind of occurred to me, this was probably 10 or 12 years ago now, was that maybe our companion animals might be a nice bridge here to accelerate the translational geroscience paradigm. And this is actually my beautiful German Shepherd, Dobby, who is getting older, so he's 11 now. You'll see I have a double-headed arrow here, and that's because I really want to make the point. This isn't only about accelerating geroscience for improving human health and longevity. It's also about the intrinsic value that I believe is there in having a positive impact on healthy longevity in our companion animals. And I absolutely would love it if we could give Dobby a couple of extra years of healthy longevity. So really two sort of overarching goals to the Dog Aging Project, and this is sort of the way I think about it in my head. One goal is to understand as much as we possibly can about the biology of aging in companion animals through a long-term longitudinal study. So really try to understand what are the most important genetic and environmental factors that influence health outcomes during aging in companion dogs. And the other is to do something about it through clinical trials, to really try to modify the biological aging process in companion dogs to increase health span and lifespan. And I'll give you an introduction to how we're tackling that in the Dog Aging Project today. So the first thing I want to do is, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time trying to convince you why dogs in particular are, I think, a uniquely powerful animal in which to study the biology of aging, but I think there are a few things that are worth just noting. One of them is everybody in this room, I'm sure, is familiar with the idea that dogs age biologically about 7 times faster than people do. We've all sort of heard the 1 human year, 7 dog years thing before. All that really means is dogs age about 7 times faster than people do. Now that's not at all a perfect equivalency, but it's pretty close. And so the implication of that is that we can actually do studies, longitudinal studies of aging, clinical trials in a time frame that's reasonable and amenable to discovery and mechanistic outcomes. So I think that's really important. The other one I want to highlight as well is that our companion dogs share our environment in pretty much every aspect, with the exception of diet. And that's something that we simply cannot recapitulate in laboratory studies. In fact, we do everything we can in the laboratory to control the environment. So I think this is a very, very powerful feature of companion dogs for studies of aging and diseases of aging. And the graphics here are meant to illustrate that. So I don't know if you can see it, but that's a dog house, and there's a dog. So just like in people, there are rich dogs, there are poor dogs on the street, there are dogs with healthier lifestyle habits, the dog that's out hiking, and then there are dogs that maybe have some questionable lifestyle habits. In case anybody's concerned, that's not my picture with the dog with the cigarette in his mouth. I did not pose that dog. Of course, dogs don't smoke typically, but they do breathe the same air that we breathe. They do drink tap water. Most people don't give bottled water to their dogs. And because we know where the dogs live, we can actually track things like air quality, water quality. How does that impact health outcomes during aging? So I think environment's going to turn out, this ability to query the environmental variation is going to turn out to be really important. And then the last one, which is most important for me, is if you love your dog and The statistics say that more than half the people in the United States consider their dog to be part of their family. If you consider your dog to be part of your family, anything we can do to increase health span and longevity in your dog has intrinsic value, and it's going to be very important both for the dog and for the people. Okay, so this is just the sort of overarching structure of the Dog Aging Project. Again, I don't have time to really dive into the details of what all these nested groups or cohorts really are all about. The largest component of the Dog Aging Project is what we call the Dog Aging Project PAC. And to be part of the PAC, what owners need to do is go to the website, click the Nominate My Dog button. There's like 4 questions you answer. It's really quick. And then the owners are invited to complete our baseline survey. And this is our primary data collection tool. It's called the Health and Life Experiences Survey, or HLES as it's listed up there. And that survey takes about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So it's pretty extensive, and we collect as much information as we can about the dog's health history, its current environment, its diet, things like that. And that's it. Once owners do that, they are part of the PAC. We now have more than, it's probably up around 43,000, 44,000 dogs in the PAC. So that means that we have collected this baseline survey information for all of those dogs. Owners are invited to also send us a qualifying veterinary electronic medical record, that's the EMR. If they do that, they become eligible for the sampled cohorts, and that's all these other groups here. And again, there's a genetics cohort. We sequence genomes of 10,000 dogs. There's the systems biology cohort, which is precision, where annually we get microbiome, metabolome, epigenome on those dogs. There's a brain health study, which is a dementia study in dogs. I'll give you a hint of some of the data we're getting from that. There's a centenarian study, dogs that live exceptionally long for their body size and breed type. What are some of the genetic correlates with that? And then there's the clinical trial, TRIAD, test of rapamycin in an aging dog, which I'll talk in a little bit more detail about in a few minutes. So that's the current structure of the Dog Aging Project. The one thing I want to emphasize is one of our core values is that we are an open science or community science project. So all of the data that we collect is made publicly available on an annual basis to anybody who wants to get access to it. There are some data use restrictions for for-profit entities. They're not a huge barrier. Anybody at a nonprofit or academic institution can get full, easy access to all of the data that we collect, updated on an annual basis. We recently published a paper in Nature that describes the structure of the Dog Aging Project, how to get access to the data. It's really easy. There's a little pull-down menu on the website that you can see over there on the right. Click Data Access, complete the data use authorization, and you're good to go. So if anybody is a data scientist that wants to do cool stuff, I'd encourage you to take a look at the year 1 release from the Dog Aging Project. I think there's really a lot of neat science that can be done that we're just not going to have the bandwidth to do. So hopefully we can get some people to dive into that. Thank you. So, and this leads me to this slide, which is that I think we're just looking at the very, very tip of the iceberg. And what I can tell you so far is it looks like this is going to be really, really cool. So I'll give you just a couple of glimpses of some of the analyses that have led to some interesting early insights. And this is all based on year 1. And so I want to make the point that year 1 is cross-sectional, right? It's a single time point on each dog. We're now in year 2, and we'll be releasing that hopefully January, where we actually have some longitudinal data, meaning we've followed the same dogs now for a year or more. Every year, we ask the owners to annually update the survey instrument. So all of the stuff I'm going to show you today is the snapshot cross-sectional data from year 1. So 41,000 plus dogs. I told you about HLES. The one thing I haven't mentioned is we have a second survey, which is much shorter, which is a cognitive assessment. It's canine social and learned behavior, and I'll show you some data from that survey in just a minute. It's like a 15-question survey that is validated to diagnose dementia in dogs, and we think it's a useful cognitive assessment on a continuous manner, and I'll tell you what I mean by that in a minute. So those are the primary data sources for year 1. So one of the interesting insights I think that came out of this year 1 data actually stemmed from a review article that I was writing on anti-aging diet. So this was published in Science, I think end of 2021 maybe, where I had sort of tried to dive into the literature on caloric restriction and dietary restriction and all the variants that have been spawned, like intermittent fasting, protein restriction, ketogenic diet, amino acid restriction, and just try to synthesize as much of that. Mostly I was doing it for myself because I was kind of confused. Try to synthesize as much of that as I could. And one of the One of the insights that I got from that process was that when I looked at the intermittent fasting and time-restricted feeding data, at least in animal models, I was completely unimpressed. When you control for calories, there is very little evidence, in my view, that intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding does anything. Maybe a tiny, tiny effect on lifespan when you control for calories, so in an isocaloric setting. So that was one of my take-homes from diving into the literature. But then it also occurred to me that dogs are sort of an interesting model where we have a sort of natural variation in how often dogs are fed, right? Some owners feed their dog once a day, some twice a day, some 3 times a day, some give their dog ad libitum access to food. Now, obviously, ad libitum access to food in dogs is a self-selection. There are some dogs where if you did that, they'd blow up, very rapidly, right? But it's kind of an interesting natural model that you could study. Maybe it's not natural, but nobody is experimentally designing this. So we asked in our pack, what is the frequency of feeding? And that's just what's shown here. Most owners in the United States feed their dog twice a day. I don't actually know how that evolved, but that is the recommendation from veterinarians, veterinary societies, and dog food makers for whatever reason. So most people do that. But some people feed their dog 3 times a day, some people ad libitum, and some people once a day. And we had a big enough group in a big enough number of dogs in each of those groups to be able to do some statistical analyses. So the first pass question we asked was, if we only look at the dogs that are fed once a day and we compare them to everybody else, are there any differences in age-related disease outcomes? Or in this case, what we're really looking at is prior diagnoses, because again, remember, this is a cross-sectional data set. So is there a difference in prior diagnoses of different age-related diseases based on feeding frequency? And going in, like I just told you, I was completely unimpressed with the literature on time-restricted feeding and intermittent fasting in mice. I said, this is never going to work. There'll be nothing here. Like is often the case, I was completely wrong. So for all 9 of the age-related conditions that we looked at, there was a reduced risk of a prior diagnosis in the dogs fed once a day versus the dogs fed more than once a day. The 10th one we looked at was cognitive function. This is published. It was published in Geroscience earlier this year if you want to dive into the data. And in 6 of the 9 cases, it was statistically significant. And in some cases, like liver-pancreas disease, it was a big effect size. So this was pretty striking. And it's one of these things where it's an imperfect data set, absolutely. But this is something I look at and I'm like, that's probably real. But I also think it's important to recognize that this does not show causality, right? So if you hear me talk, you'll almost always hear me say correlation does not equal causation, right? So this could mean that time-restricted feeding in dogs has an impact on aging and age-related health outcomes. It could also mean that there's something else associated with once-a-day feeding in dogs that is having this impact. And one obvious thing might be dogs fed once a day are less likely to be obese. And I don't know whether that's the case because we don't have that data in our data set yet. So I think this is a really interesting example of a hypothesis-generating observation that you can get from this type of cross-sectional data, not even longitudinal yet, in a large enough population of companion animals. So pretty interesting. And I know some people who have decided to start feeding their dog once a day based on this. I've got an old dog. There's no way I'm going to start feeding him once a day when he's used to being fed two or three times a day. So anyways, I thought this was a pretty cool outcome, and it was a strong signal. So now I want to talk briefly about cognitive function, because I think this is another thing that surprised me when I looked at the data. So this is what you're seeing here is the score from the Canine Social and Learned Behavior Survey, which I alluded to earlier. It's a cognitive assessment that's clinically validated in veterinary medicine for diagnosing dementia in dogs. So there's a disease called canine cognitive dysfunction, which is a dementia in dogs. The way the tool is used, sorry for the glitch in the formatting there, I'm not sure what happened. The way the tool is used in practice is it's a binary tool. So I think, like I said, there are like 15 questions, and there's a scoring algorithm based on how people answer the questions. And if the score is above 50, that's diagnostic for dementia. If it's below 50, it's not diagnostic for dementia. Hopefully that makes sense. So it's binary, yes or no. We were, first of all, very interested in whether or not this could be used as a continuous tool. Could we detect mild cognitive impairment, age-associated cognitive decline? And so this is showing you the data as a function of age for male and female dogs from the pack. Higher score, again, is worse cognitive function, or at least over 50 is the validated use of this tool for dementia. And so the first thing I would say is it very much looks like this is, in fact, detecting age-related cognitive decline below the diagnostic threshold of 50. There's clearly a strong age-related uptick in score, which would be interpreted as a decline in cognitive function with age in dogs based on this survey. No real difference between male and female, which is kind of interesting. But the more interesting thing to me is no real difference based on body weight. And the reason that's interesting is when you look at almost every other phenotype of aging and age-related disease in dogs and lifespan, big dogs age faster than small dogs. That doesn't seem to be the case for cognitive function. And again, I'm overinterpreting this a little bit because I haven't proven to you or myself yet that this can be used as a continuous tool, but it sure looks like it can. And there's no difference based on body weight. So is that telling us that maybe there's something different about the brain and the relationship between body size and rate of aging and the rest of the body? And I think there are some hints in the literature that you can find to support that when you look at insulin IGF-1 signaling in the brain versus other parts of the body and longevity in laboratory models. There's even some hints in humans that this could be true. So it's kind of, again, an interesting observation that is hypothesis generating going forward.
What's the red line? It sort of looks like a signal in the female.
Yeah, so, I think that's like the medium-sized dog. I'm sorry that got cut off. It's not the smallest or the biggest. Yeah, apologize for that. Yeah, I should say too, I need to update this slide. This was an early model, and that kind of goes away with the bigger data set. So, but yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about related to dementia was another observation that came out of the first year's data set, looking at cognitive function in dogs, or specifically diagnosis of dementia, which again remains higher than score of 50 on the CSLB, and other things that we had in the survey, and what might be the most important factors that would correlate with risk of dementia in dogs. And not surprisingly, age is number one. Great, that affirms everything that we think should be the case. Age is the greatest risk factor of dementia in dogs, just like it is in people. Number two was activity. Again, not shocking, but really nice to see that this is holding up. What we think is true in people probably is true in dogs as well, that the more active a dog is is associated with a lower risk of dementia. And I think the risk, I think it was, yeah, like about 6.5-fold from going from very active to sedentary in dogs. And again, remember, this is all owner reported, so we actually don't have any quantitative measurements of activity. This is just the owners were asked, how active has your dog been over the last year? A couple other things that seem to impact risk were sterilization. So again, there are really 4 sexes in dogs, companion dogs: intact male, intact female, sterilized female. About 80%, I think maybe even 90% of the dogs in our pack, and I think that tracks with the general companion animal population in the United States, are sterilized. So sterilization seems to maybe have a small effect on risk of dementia, and then prior history of some other age-related diseases, which could turn out to be interesting, but we actually don't have any real insightful thoughts on what the mechanisms might be there. So again, pretty cool, and as you might expect, people love dogs. It's easy to write news stories about dogs, so this got picked up by the New York Times, which was pretty cool. One of my favorite things to say is my dog, Dobby, is one of the few dogs in the world to have ever been featured in the New York Times, not once, but twice, which is pretty awesome, I think. Okay. So now I'll talk about the clinical trial with rapamycin, test of rapamycin in aging dogs. And again, the goal here is really to answer the question, does rapamycin increase lifespan, improve health span in companion dogs? The reason for testing this is I would argue rapamycin is the gold standard for a pharmacological intervention having an impact on lifespan and health span in laboratory animals. The reason for that is that it works. It works over and over and over again. Everybody in the field agrees that it works. The effect size is the largest, and actually I'm going to take issue. I think it was Eric who showed a slide with percentages from different interventions. So those percentages are misleading because in the cases where the percent is big, the denominator is small, meaning the control animals lived shorter. So if you look at the absolute lifespan, rapamycin for a pharmacological intervention, to the best of my knowledge, has the longest effect on median and maximum lifespan when you look at just absolute number of days lived. So I'm still going to say it's the most effective pharmacological longevity intervention. We can argue about that if we want to. The cool thing about rapamycin, though, is it works when you start in middle age, which is important if you want to have a translational intervention. And even transient treatments are sufficient to give you most of the effect for lifespan and the health span metrics that have been looked at. So, for example, 6 to 12-week treatments with rapamycin can increase lifespan by almost the same magnitude and also have impacts on many other organs and tissues, which are kind of listed over there to the right. And in the cases that are shown in red, what I personally find most exciting is you can actually see functional improvements. So you can see declines in function in those organs and tissues with age. This is in mice. And short-term treatments with rapamycin of 6 to 10 weeks can reverse those functional declines. So this is telling us, and I'm not saying that rapamycin is reversing aging. Please, I hate that phrase. It's not taking an old mouse and making it young again, but you can see functional improvements, which again is, if you're thinking about a clinical trial, that's actually pretty powerful, right? If that was the case in humans, and you could actually, instead of just slowing the decline, actually see things get better, that's a really nice endpoint to look at for clinical trials. So I think that's a really important aspect of rapamycin that is maybe underappreciated. Okay. So this is the design of TRIAD. Our goal is to enroll and randomize 580 dogs. This is a double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial. We have block randomization at each site. The entrance criteria are pretty stringent. So the dogs have to have no significant pre-existing condition. This is a trial of healthy aging, so they can't come in with heart disease or cancer or any other significant pre-existing condition. Half rapamycin, half placebo. The dose is there. I don't really want to get into the dose because I think it's complicated and honestly we don't know what the best dose of rapamycin is. We're doing 0.15 milligrams per kilogram given once a week. Happy to answer questions about that or talk to people outside if you're really interested in the dosing strategy. The treatment period is 1 year with 2-year follow-up. So it's a 3-year length of the trial. And the reason for that 3-year length and the 580 dogs is that given the expected mortality kinetics in this population, 3 years should be long enough to give us power to detect a 9% change in lifespan. So lifespan is the primary endpoint based on those statistics. So that's why it's a 3-year length and 580 dogs. But of course, we're interested in health span. So we have multiple secondary endpoints which to the best of our ability, capture age-related functional changes and disease diagnoses that are common in aging dogs. So for example, we're going to look at obviously things like cancer and kidney disease and heart disease. All of the, half the dogs get echocardiograms, half the dogs get neurological exams. So we're really trying to query health span as best we can. This is based on preliminary data from 2 small clinical trials. One was 10 weeks, one was 6 months. No significant adverse events in either trial. Both trials, the owners reported increased activity. We didn't have quantitative measurements, so that's owner reported. Take it for what it's worth. And we found some evidence for improved heart function in the first clinical trial, which is shown here. I don't want to dive into this data too deeply. I just want to give you a feel for the kinds of things we're looking at. So this is based on echocardiography. This is a measure of left ventricular function, so fractional shortening. We picked the left ventricular functional endpoints based on mouse data. So I told you earlier that there's evidence that 8 weeks of rapamycin can improve functional outcomes in mice. That's been seen in multiple studies by echocardiogram. So that's why we picked these endpoints. This data, though, the way it's presented here, I think is useful as a visualization tool. So what's shown here, again, this is a 10-week study. We have baseline, animals were randomized, and then at the end of the 10-week study, they got a second echocardiogram after they finished the treatment phase. So this is baseline echocardiogram measurement versus on the y-axis, the exit echocardiogram measurement, okay? So if you look at the dotted line, that's y equals x. Any dot or triangle that's on that line means there was no change in the functional measure from baseline till end. Okay, so that's a way to orient yourself. Anything that's below the line, there was a decline in function. Anything that's above the line, there was an improvement in function. I want to emphasize all of these dogs were in the normal functional range. Okay, so again, this is not disease. This is within the reference range as it exists in veterinary medicine today. Okay, so the dots are placebo, the triangles are rapamycin treated. The thing I want to I want you to notice here, so it is statistically significant, barely, small n, not going to draw too many conclusions from that. The thing I thought was interesting here is if you look at the blue dots, they're more or less scattered, right? Above and below the line, more of them are below the line, so there's a slight decline in function over that 10-week period. But if you look at the rapamycin-treated dogs, the ones where there was a positive effect above the line are the ones that came in with a lower baseline, okay? And I actually think this is going to be pretty important when we think about trying to do geroscience clinical trials in healthy populations, right? There's a whole range of function that can be defined as normal. It's maybe the individuals that come in at the lower end of the normal range, they're most likely to get the benefit if your intervention is working. So I can't prove that's what happened here. We need obviously more data, which we'll get from TRIAD, but I think it's an interesting thing to keep in mind for those of you who are thinking about maybe doing these kinds of clinical trials in healthy populations. Okay. This is just a side effect incidents, so to speak, from the first trial. This was all collected by owner survey. So every week the owners got a survey that said in the last week, have you noticed any of these changes in your dog? If you look at the list, first thing to say is there's nothing significant between the placebo and rapamycin group. If you look at this list and you've ever had an old dog, you will appreciate why you need a placebo group in a study like this. Most old dogs in any 10-week period will experience one of these potential adverse events. So no difference. The thing I thought that was kind of interesting and funny was we also had two questions at the end of each survey, which was in the last week, have you noticed any changes in your dog that you would consider negative? And they could just fill in whatever they wanted. Or have you noticed any changes in your dog that you would consider positive? And they could fill in whatever they wanted. So this was unprompted. We didn't encourage them to give any answer. And the two things that might be real were, as I mentioned, more owners whose dogs got rapamycin reported increased energy. That also was seen in the second clinical trial. So I think that's probably real, but we need to quantify it. The one that I thought was most amusing, though, was that 4 of the owners whose dogs got rapamycin said their dog was more affectionate. So I don't know what that means, but wouldn't it be great if rapamycin made your dog love you more? It might reflect cognitive function. It might, you know, we could speculate, but it's funny. And maybe it's real, right? Maybe rapamycin will be the love drug. I don't know. All right. So this is a schematic of the design of the clinical trial. So again, dogs have to be healthy, normal health at the beginning of the trial. They come in, assuming they pass that screening exam. They are randomized into either rapamycin or placebo, block randomized at each site, 50-50. And then every 6 months, for the whole 3 years, they come back for another veterinary exam where they get either an echocardiogram or a neurological exam. We get microbiome, epigenome, metabolome, blood chemistry, cognitive assessments every 6 months. And then hopefully, we're still trying to figure out the activity monitoring, but we'll get some sort of quantitative activity data using like Fitbits for dogs. Hopefully that'll turn out to be useful data. 1-year treatment, 2-year follow-up, and then the dog is out of the study. Obviously, we'll keep in touch with those owners. I think there'll be interesting data after that 3-year period, but the formal end of the study will be when all the dogs have completed the 3 years. Okay, so this is a nice design. I love it. It's been very slow, I will admit, getting this trial subscribed. So we are still enrolling. We will likely be enrolling through the end of next year. For those of you who have seen me talk about this trial before, you're kind of like, Matt keeps moving the goalposts. I thought this was supposed to be done, you know, in early 2022. It's been slow, and I think I'm happy to talk about some of the challenges. I'll mention some of them in a minute in doing this kind of a trial. COVID didn't help, obviously, but I'm pretty optimistic we will, in fact, get this trial fully subscribed somewhere between June and December of next year, and then it'll be 3 years from that before we have the final readout. So I wish I could tell you the answer today. We don't know, but we're well on our way to actually hopefully answering the question whether or not we see any significant benefits from rapamycin in dogs, or detriments, right? There could be upticks in certain side effects. Okay, so here are some of the thoughts that I have about trying to do this kind of a clinical trial in dogs. Am I running out of time? Okay. I'm almost done. All right, so you know, I think owners are super enthusiastic to do these kinds of clinical trials. I think designing the appropriate exclusion criteria is critical, and I worry a little bit that we have a healthy cohort bias because we've been so stringent about excluding dogs who have pre-existing conditions. So that could actually hurt us if rapamycin is actually having the effect that we think it is, that our population is too healthy. So I'm a little bit worried about that. It's hard. So all of our clinical sites right now are veterinary teaching hospitals, although we will have some private practice clinics in the near future. They're mostly rural, so that makes it challenging. And veterinarians are really busy, right? They're trying to do their job, and getting them to focus on a clinical trial is hard. And the reason why I mention these things is I think there is an important place for companion animal geroscience clinical trials. I've talked to many, many people who would love to be able to test their intervention in companion animals, but I think there's a real bottleneck to being able to do that because the infrastructure doesn't exist, and it's really, really hard to do a trial of this size in companion animals. So why companion animals? They're better than lab-based animals. I definitely believe that. I think if we can show that we can slow aging in companion animals, the impact is large. We can actually do lifespan. I've told you that, and I've showed you how. And we can measure health span and many disease endpoints at the same time in these kinds of clinical trials. And probably most of you know, but in case you don't, FDA does approve drugs for veterinary use through the Center for Veterinary Medicine. So you can get FDA approval for your drug. And you could actually do an aging study, a lifespan study. You could get approval for lifespan. And I think the market is large. It's not as large as the human market, but certainly hundreds of millions of dollars for veterinary approval for a new drug. So what has to be overcome? I said there's no infrastructure. I think that's the biggest one. It'd be great if we had a registry of interested owners. It'd be great if we had some experienced clinical trial sites. I think there are some challenges to both veterinary teaching hospitals and private practice. And I think there might be an opportunity for a dedicated geroscience CRO to do these kinds of geroscience clinical trials. And I'm going to stop with that, but I just want to plant the seed in case any of you are interested. I'd be happy to talk with you about it. I don't have the bandwidth to build this thing, but I think it could be of pretty big value to the field if there were ways that companies developing interventions who wanted to do geroscience clinical trials in companion animals could do that. So sorry for going a little bit over, Kristen. Thank you for your patience. And I'll be happy to answer any questions afterward if Kristen wants to get me off the stage. So thanks. Do you want me to leave? One or two, okay.
How hard was it to decide in a 3-year endpoint, how hard was it for you to decide to only have 12 months of treatment?
Well, I mean, obviously it was tough, right? I mean, again, this is, so I think this gets at the more general point that anytime you're designing a clinical trial, you have to make the best guesses you can on things like that, given the constraints that you're working under. So I will be completely honest and tell you, I would have preferred a 3-year treatment. The reasons for not doing a 3-year treatment were mostly pragmatic. One, even though I don't think we're likely to see side effects from rapamycin that are significant, the risk goes down if you're only treating for 1 year. And two, it's an expensive clinical trial with that amount of drug we had to buy, and we didn't have the budget to do 3 years. So, but yeah, that's good. Great point.
I notice your dose is about half, weekly dose about half what it was in your initial 24-dog study.
Yeah, same answer. Safer and cheaper. And we saw effects at this lower dose in the first study too. So we felt okay with that dose. I've got 2 people raising their hand, one who has a microphone. So I'll get to you, Brad, and then I'll get off the stage so Kristen can feel better about it. Go ahead, Pankaj.
Yeah, great talk, Matt. I was wondering if you can stratify the data according to the size of the dogs, and would the data look better maybe on the larger dogs versus the smaller dogs?
Yeah, sorry, I guess I skipped over that. So all the dogs in the trial have to be at least 40 pounds. So we're already enriching for larger dogs because big dogs age faster. We needed to do that to get the statistical power. We could potentially, within that, stratify even more. Look at the very biggest dogs and the medium-sized dogs. I share your speculation, which I think is what you're saying, that rapamycin might work better in bigger dogs. But yeah, we could do that. I don't know if we'll have enough power. Depends obviously on the effect size and all of that.
Are there ways to already look at different breeds of dogs and look at sort of some biomarkers which would predict TOR activity and gauge from that, or you just have to do the experiment, you think?
Yeah, I don't think we have any good ways in dogs. One of the challenges in dogs is that the reagents that we have in mice usually don't exist. For the research reagents that are used to measure things like cytokines and mTOR signaling and stuff like that. So, so it's harder. Not impossible, but harder. But I would say we don't have any great molecular markers of mTOR activity in dogs. Brad, did you want to ask a quick question and I'll answer it quickly?
Yeah, so first of all, that's awesome. Thank you. And the second one is, there's various
Yeah, great question. The answer is no, not yet, but we are redesigning or we have a new survey that dives a little bit deeper on both composition of the diet and amount of food consumed. So we have body weight. There is no great BMI score that's easy to implement in dogs because of the differences in shapes and sizes. So hopefully we'll get a little better feeling for that, but I can't answer that right now. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks, Kristen, for your patience.